A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this 116th episode of the Together for Education webinars brought to you by Notebook. Long back in April 2020, when the pandemic had just set in, we at Notebook started out with this series of webinars with the objective of connecting the school education community, a place where schools could exchange ideas, thoughts, share their problems, and seek solutions to the various new issues that they were facing every single day. Well, honestly, we had expected it to last for maybe a month or two. Little did we know that more than a year later, more than 115 episodes later, I would be welcoming all of you to it again. For this wonderful journey we have had, I need to thank each and every one of you. The experience has been most humbling. We have discussed a myriad set of topics over these last so many weeks. We have discussed curriculum, we have discussed NEP, we have discussed student behavior, classroom management, lesson planning. We've also discussed sports and games, extracurriculars, and so much more. Today, we are going to step across our international borders. We are going to look at education overseas. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, we knew that there was a certain amount of fantasy value attached to learning overseas. People would often fantasize about going to colleges overseas. They would want to finish school here and move abroad in search of a better education. I say better within quotes, because perhaps that better was often a function of perception and not so much a reality. Or was it? Today, we are going to discuss the various facets attached to this topic of education overseas. To discuss this, our first speaker today is Achin Bhattacharya. Achin is the founder and CEO at Notebook. A chartered accountant by training, Achin was a director at Deloitte prior to starting Notebook. He has worked in India and abroad in various senior capacities in GE, PwC, KPMG, and Deloitte. Achin is a fellow of the ICAI and a member of CPA Australia and CPA Ireland. He is also the recipient of the prestigious Indian Achievers Award. Achin is an avid reader and a passionate traveler with keen interests in economics, history, literature, and philosophy. He is a regular speaker at various forums and chambers of commerce and also contributes articles to numerous publications regularly. He is also on the board of some of the most renowned corporates and contributes significantly to their brand strategies. Achin, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Shubha, am I audible?
Yeah, Achin, we can hear you. There seems to be a bit of a disturbance on the line.
Is it better now?
A little better. Let's hope this holds. Please carry on.
I once again welcome all of you to today's session on a multidimensional topic which is becoming increasingly relevant due to globalization. As esteemed educators, all of you are very much aware about your students traveling abroad for higher education, about universities around the world trying to get attention of Indian students, right? Indian students considering the large number that we offer to the entire world, considering the kind of academic achievements and laurels that our students have had in foreign shows. Definitely, we have seen this trend. Today, let's deliberate on this. Now, there are two clearly distinct schools of thought. Those for the motion, like as Shubha mentioned, that yes, that was the perception when it was in 80s and 90s, but today does the perception still hold good? So to examine this in more detail, those for the motion, those who really advocate this, their views are that globalization is here to stay, and students who want to work in our interconnected global world should study abroad. So this is something that yes, we all do agree with. The learning how to interact with people from other countries and cultures undoubtedly equips future leaders in all sectors to address urgent issues shared across borders. We can all foresee an inevitable increasing global competition for jobs. Often graduates, and that's the reality, often graduates may lack the international experience. Experience of at times when it's very common now. And forget jobs which are higher up in the value chain. Even jobs like data analysis, data processing, etc. in BPOs or call centers, very often teams are spread across geographies. So the whole experience of having language capabilities, cross-cultural communication skills, which are necessary to succeed into this global economy. Now, overseas education actually pushes a student to get out of his or her comfort zone to experience another culture, language, environment, education system. It really teaches students to appreciate difference and diversity firsthand and enables them to recognize and then dismiss stereotypes they may have held about people they have never met. Now, learning how to interact with people from other countries and cultures, as we discussed, it really equips us, and leads to solution of many issues from whether that be from curing diseases, finding energy solutions, to fighting terrorism, hunger, because these are issues which are common, shared across cultures, shared across nations. However, there are counter arguments as well on the other side. So today, if you look at the cost and trade-offs, because we are not only discussing about the privileged few, we are not only discussing about the tip of the pyramid, we are discussing about students from various planes. So today, if you look at the cost and trade-off, so today, if you look at those huge student loans whose EMI students will struggle to pay, maybe for decades, and also question the value for the money spent. We cannot lose sight of the forest for the trees when it comes to discussing what's best for our students. We can also argue that learning success will be driven more by good accountable teachers, and there's no dearth of good educators in our country, and by involved parents than by any study abroad programs. So many feel that focusing our attention on what is offered in the classroom must take priority over advocating for this overseas programs. So for a minute, so once we understand the benefit in terms of cultural exposure, in terms of broadening one's vision, and on the other side, when we also discuss about the consequential costs, etc. For a minute, let's take a very objective view on the topic. And how do we take an objective view? I guess the only way to take an objective view is to disassociate ourselves from the topic. So let's look at this particular topic as a case study to understand the practical pros and cons in more details. So as a case study, let's look at China, for instance, because the moment we discuss about one country, so naturally at times our thoughts might get a little colored by nationalistic sentiments or by other issues, etc., which are very natural. So if we take a more objective view, if we just step aside for a second and look at a different country. So today, if we look at China, and why China? Because today, if you look at student numbers, students who are studying abroad in various parts of the world, highest number of students who are studying abroad today are Chinese students. So they top the world in terms of number of students who are studying abroad. Now, students who come back to China after studying abroad are known as Haigui. That's a nickname for Chinese students and scholars who return from overseas. It's very common in Chinese media, etc. So from today, if you look at it from 1978 to 2003, so around total 7 lakh students, 7 lakh Chinese students and scholars studied in more than 108 countries and regions all over the world, covering almost all disciplines. With encouragement of government policy, more young people are leaving China today to study abroad. Now, these Haigui brought back the advanced technology and management that China needed badly in its economic takeoff. And in the meantime, they succeeded in their career development in China. So study abroad, actually, it spurred economic development, but at the same time, also brought in some other problems, such as Western ideas and culture flooded into China. Some students even stayed in foreign countries, foreign shores, after they completed their study. And then we all know that does happen, right? Some others could not find jobs after they returned to China. So certain disciplines which were well ahead of time in terms of where China was at that particular point of time. So they had to again go back. There are more and more Chinese students studying abroad now. Some of them are still studying in foreign countries. Now, The question is that if you look at things from a little bit of a historical background today, when we're discussing this as a case study, as we're all aware that China was one of the powerful countries in the world in ancient times. But in modern history, China was defeated by the gunboats and modern technology of the West. China was forced to open its door by the Western powers after the Opium War in 1840. Now, intellectuals realized that the lack of modern technology and democracy was China's weakening. So, in the May 4th movement, they called for learning modern science and technology from foreign countries. Now, before the founding, before the founding of the People's Republic of China, there were already a lot of Chinese who were going abroad for further education in order to bring home knowledge that could help build a stronger economy. But after the establishment of New China in 1949, the Chinese government decided to send students and scholars to the former Soviet Union and other socialist countries to study advanced science, technology, and management skills. But in the 1960s and 70s, study abroad became static due to political atmosphere in China and the cultural revolution, which many of all of you are aware of. Now, since the reform and opening up in 1978, work related to students and scholars studying abroad has seen rapid development. China sent the first group of scholars to study in US because initially, as I told you, it was more towards Soviet and other socialist countries. So the first group of Chinese students who traveled to US after the Cultural Revolution was only as late as 1978. In harmony with the socio-economic development, a management and implementation system related to students and scholars studying abroad has been set up in higher education institutions, as well as in science and technology research institutions, from the national to local level. So at all levels, multiple levels are involved. Now, this system mainly consists of three complementary channels for students and scholars. Namely, so when Chinese students are going, either they're state funded, or they're employer funded, or they're self-funded. According to Ministry of Education of People's Republic of China, from, as I told you, from 78 to 2003. Why 78? Because we're discussing about first year when students went to US. So from 78 to 2003, a total number of around 7 lakh Chinese students and scholars studied in more than 108 countries all over the world, covering almost all disciplines. Both the quantity and scale was unprecedented in the history of China. Now, during the same period, out of 7 lakh, only around 1.7 lakh returned. As for those who did not return, half of them, around 3.5 lakh, are still studying. Where still studying, doing some research, visiting scholars in foreign higher education institutions. In 2003, like as late as 2003, I was going through some numbers. If you look at the trend, even more than 1 lakh students were studying, and today numbers are much higher. So I'm talking more from a historical perspective. And of course, most of them self-funded, but also a lot of them state-funded and employer-funded. Now, US, of course, a lot of students are attracted towards US, but also towards countries like UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Netherlands, Singapore, Germany, and France. Now, year on year, it has been increasing at an annual rate of 40% over past years. So now, in the light of above case study, there are some questions, and I guess the answers lie within those questions itself. So, did China really learn from these foreign countries? Did China's economy, did this help to develop China's economy rapidly, especially in science and technology, or was it all homegrown? We all know the answers. In addition to science and technology, what else did China learn from foreign countries? What about Western ideology coming into China? Did it really affect China's modern development? Now, also, I think the way I look at it, so this was just a case study which we discussed. Of course, we are aware about our own students going abroad. Many of them doing fantastically well, be it in their corporate life, be it in their research. We read about Nobel laureates, etc. But I also understand, and I'm sure all of you would appreciate and agree with the fact that we as a nation, we have also come a long way. So there are institutions of repute today in our country. There's no doubt about it. There are very committed teachers and faculties. A lot of good work is happening. But yes, there are pros and cons on both sides. And undoubtedly, I think not only it's not only about domain knowledge. The way I look at it, education is a lifelong journey, and much of our wisdom comes from sources other than our textbooks. So life, as we all know, is a great teacher. But the challenge is there is simply too much to know. And I think as the title of ex-bureaucrat and former Minister of External Affairs, Mr. Natwar Singh's book very beautifully summarizes it. The name of the book, I'm sure many of you must have read it. It's a wonderful book. One life is not enough. So it's a great title. So that it is important to see the world through the eyes of the other person, to know about peoples, places, cultures, which helps in building your attitude towards life. And why is attitude important? I believe attitude is the most important thing. And why so? So I'll share a small story. I had a very interesting conversation on board in an international flight. So once I remember, quite a few many years back, I was traveling to Europe, and a very renowned entrepreneur was my fellow passenger, and he once told me that he's extremely proud of two things in life. So when he introduced himself, and I asked him, "Sir, how has your journey been?" He was very senior at that point of time, well into his late 70s, and I asked him, "That sir, how has your journey been? So I want to learn from you." And he said that, "Son, I'm extremely proud of two things in life. First, that I have never fired anyone in last 30 years. Now that was a great news, right? And second, in all these years, he had never incurred loss in even one quarter. So throughout his business has been profitable, modest returns, and he didn't fire anybody in last 30 years." So I was very impressed, and I asked him the secret of his success. He had a simple answer: hiring people with the right attitude. So beyond a certain level, domain knowledge is given. The most important differentiating factor is attitude. But the question is, how do we develop a winning attitude? Now, we all agree that exposure plays a very important part. So exposure, the kind of exposure we give a student, we give a child, right? And exposure cannot be confined to only textbooks and classroom lectures. I think it's far beyond. And definitely overseas education, if you look at things from the perspective of broadening one's horizon, being far more receptive towards a new culture, meeting new people, knowing about history, being much more flexible, facing challenges, coming out of the comfort zone. Overseas education, I guess, goes far beyond academics. So that's my take on this. Now, these are a few important points that I wanted to convey. I thank all of you for giving me a patient hearing. We have a wonderful panel here today, and I really look forward to the deliberation on this topic. Over to you, Shumai.
Thank you, Vachin. Thank you for giving us such a global perspective of the topic today. Well, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker today is Meghna Laha. Meghna is one from our team at Notebook. She is an associate vice president with us. But more importantly, she is an alumnus of two foreign universities. Given that our topic today is education overseas, we thought, why not listen to somebody who's had the experience firsthand of studying abroad. After finishing her school in India, Meghna did her undergraduate studies in the US, first at the University of Rhode Island, where she did her Master of Science at the Department of Environmental and Natural Resources Economics at the Kingston Coastal Institute of the University of Rhode Island. She then joined the Columbia University in New York, where between 2006 and 2007, she did a program at the School of International Public Affairs, which was called the Program of Economic Policy and Management, and earned her the degree of Master of Public Administration. Prior to joining Notebook, Meghna has also had a stint as a full-time consultant at World Bank, where she was overseeing projects across multiple countries in Africa. Meghna, pleasure to have you here today. Over to you. Meghna, you there?
Hello, am I audible, Shubhayu?
Yeah, Meghna, we can hear you. We can't see you yet.
Okay, so I guess I'll just have to give me a second, all right?
Sure.
Yeah. Can you see me now?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you. All right, thank you so much. So, hello everyone, and thanks to Shubhayu. I'm extremely humbled by your introduction. And hello to all of our guests here who have joined us during this session on overseas education. I'm very happy to be a part of this panel today and extremely honored. Thank you so much to all of you. Uh, just refer to one of the words that Shubhayu used. He said that it's almost a fantasy for us. We fantasize being outside of India. We want to go out and experience international education. And I was one of them, just growing up and wanting to be outside and going outside and experiencing that. So I would say that I was very lucky enough to experience much of it all as a student of undergraduate studies and graduate education in the United States, and have been asked by my colleagues today to share some of my experiences with the rest of you who have joined us. Now, of the 12 years I've spent in the USA, about 60% of that was for my education at various levels, right from the undergraduate to the graduate level. So I will be speaking of the United States, more of US education that I know better and I have experienced personally. And I'd like to talk about three very important points that I think I have observed as one of those things that, sort of keeps basically for which US stands out from other countries and why we are so hooked to US education. It's just not because of any reason. There are various reasons for which we feel that US education is one of the best in the world. So I'll talk about three subtopics of this topic, overseas education. And one of them is the flow of the education system in the United States, which has marveled me many times, and the flexibility of the system, and also the existing credit system that confers degrees and diplomas to candidates studying under various levels. So speaking of the flow of the education system, you may be knowing that the world's largest and most well-ranked universities are from the United States of America. With this in the hindsight, we also know that the US school system is very simple, almost juvenile when compared to other countries of the world, like China and India. But have we ever asked ourselves, how in the world do we have such well-performing, brilliant US candidates compete with other Asian counterparts during their master's or PhD level education? In fact, the thesis in PhD studies is hardly dominated by Asian candidates. We have the best of performers emerge from the US background during the PhD dissertations and publications. So if you think deeply, you will notice that the merging somewhat takes place in the final years of the bachelor's program when Americans sort of catch up with the rest of the world. The credit certainly goes to the flow or structure of the course and how professors are trained to pace up the value of the learning process during the final years. Now, this is a very interesting observation. It is my personal observation because I've seen that without a gap in years, students are able to level themselves up with well-performing candidates from around the world. And most of the secret lies in the way professors conduct the courses. In most cases, every topic starts from the basics so that students joining the class from other programs have an opportunity to navigate the course right from the start. And this is irrespective of any topic. So it's assumed that students would come across from various backgrounds to join a class of music or history or sociology, and professors therefore start from the very basics, even at the master's level, to teach their students. So this is kind of an example of the flow of the education system that is marvelous in United States. And I don't think this is something that is followed in India, although in some institutes we do have the process. We have the same process where professors try and inculcate the basics of any topic right from the beginning. So moving on to the master's program, we see that, as I was saying, that the US candidates, they kind of catch up with the rest of the world. They are also prepared to face competition from other countries and eventually sometimes surpass them during the PhD studies. So if you look at enrollment in MIT and Harvard and the best of the schools in the US, you will see that the percentage of American students is no less than the percentage of candidates joining from other parts of the world. In fact, I think I would say 50% of the candidates are Americans who are joining these programs, and there is no bias to these admissions that take place. So as an example, I would say that while I was at Columbia University, I was part of this program called Program of Economic Policy and Management. And this is one of the toughest programs in Columbia, if not the most toughest, because it was for 1 year. And in 1 year, you had to complete 60 master's level credits, which is kind of impossible. It is kind of impossible to do it, but we had to do it because it was part of the program. And there were 55 candidates from around the world. 50 of them were Fulbright scholars. 5 were not, and I was one of those 5 candidates who were not a Fulbright scholar. So, while experiencing this kind of, cultural diversity in a class, and it would almost seem like you are actually sitting in a class or in United Nations, basically, from people around the world, I would say that Americans still fared well and in some cases did better than us. So the flow of or the structure of the education system in the US is commendable. If anyone wants to go out to the US and study, I think this should be one of the reasons that they should, think of and also want to experience, because it's very unique to the rest of the world. Now, that was the first subtopic that I told you that I would be speaking on. The next one is also another observation that I had. It is the flexibility of the education system. One of my very close friends, as an example, I would like to mention, she had a PhD in linguistics and statistics almost at the same time from University of Connecticut. So statistics and linguistics, you can imagine the range of topic that I'm talking about, I mean, a discipline that I'm talking about. At that time, I had praised and congratulated her. I had also wondered at the flexibility of the education system in the US that let her do it. It had the option for her to complete both and almost at the same time. Probably very few countries in the world would offer the same range of opportunities at that level. So the flexibility of the system, you can imagine, is immense. Courses are broken down into credits, and this is exactly possible because I'll explain right now how this is possible. Courses are basically broken down into credits, and each course is ideally of 3 credits. So to complete your undergraduate studies, for example, you need to have 120 credits, and for the master's program, you need to have 60 credits. Now, to earn these 120 credits, obviously, you need 40 courses. 40 into 3 is 120. And this would have to come out of 8 semesters and hence 5 courses per semester. So if you are a very smart student or pretty well organized, you can also finish before time. I guess it's also possible in India. If you can earn those 120 credits in 3 years, fine. But there are some restrictions because not all of the core courses are offered all at the same time. So they ensure that you spend some amount of time in the university to finish the degree program. So the experience is gathered well and you go through the program as expected by the professor. The equation is therefore very simple. Some of these courses are core courses that you have to finish, they're mandatory, and some are optional. Now, it's the optional that you can replace with other courses from other departments. So the simple equation is you can take the necessary credits for becoming an aeronautical engineer if you are aspiring to be so, but also learn music, history, mythology, just as I mentioned, and become an artist for a second career choice. And believe it or not, my friends, in some cases, the second option works out better than the first one in your latter part of life. So all you need to do is complete the core courses and finish off the 120 credits to earn your undergraduate bachelor's degree with a combination of other courses from other disciplines. And hence, and now you understand how my friend had actually got a PhD in statistics and linguistics at the same time. So might also be fair to keep note that right after the 4 years of bachelor's, you can follow. So you have these 120 credits that you need to fulfill. And once you have these 120 credits done in a particular discipline with 4 courses, you can follow your master's in the United States. And the 4-year degree can be from any part of the world, but it has to be comparable to a US 4 years bachelor's. So typically, an engineering degree from India qualifies for a bachelor's in the US, but a BCom, BS may not. In fact, many students are unaware that one can apply for a PhD admission right after a 4 years degree from India. A master's is not required at all. Now, this again comes from my experience that I'm telling you, that I have visited several colleges and universities in the southern part of our country, wherein students who are pursuing engineering degrees did not have the idea that they can actually directly apply to a PhD degree program once they complete their 4 years bachelor's. It's a common misconception that Indian students have, that a 4-year engineering degree has to be followed by a master's to obtain a PhD admission in the same field in the USA. So it's very important to keep note of that. Once again, coming back to the US system, the education system is very standardized. Courses are relatively common for a particular discipline. They might be of a different standard. So typically, a course that is being offered at Harvard may not be at the same level compared to one that is being offered at a B grade school in some other university. I'm sorry to say that. There are different standards at which these courses are offered, but majority of the courses are common, so they are very standardized. And let me give you another. I would like to give you one of my other share with you another observation that I have. If you're looking for a B grade school in the US, remember that it is like asking for a B grade college or university in India and facing similar consequences. For example, MBA from IIM is obviously different from a MBA from Symbiosis, and an IIM pass out obviously has better job opportunities than a Symbiosis pass out, and this happens in the United States as well. So you may have a US degree from the University of Kentucky, for example, or University of Nebraska, a B grade school, in which case you may have to compete with a Yale pass out, an Ivy League school. So the job market is as competitive as anywhere in the world. Students from best universities are always preferred. So I suggest don't be super happy getting admission from anywhere and any school in the US. It needs to be a well-rated school with a well-rated discipline. Now let's shift to some details on the PhD discipline. The scope of studies in PhD is quite praiseworthy. PhD dissertations typically take 4 years, and every candidate has to choose 4 to 5 professors for PhD defense. Students take education very seriously. A degree is sought after only if the candidate has the need or passion to go for it. Nobels and Pulitzer Prizes are university jewels in crowns. Universities compete for such prizes every year, and competition is fierce and intense. You may have Harvard and MIT competing for a Nobel for contributions to physics at the same time, and quite often the Nobel goes to the school that has better lobbied for it. Now, you may not always want to finish the PhD for a discipline that you have chosen. There could be a change of mind or a certain circumstance that does not allow the candidate to follow through his or her original plan. The university then allows the candidate to pass out with a master's subject to a qualifying examination. This exam is called the qualifiers, and the qualifiers are very interesting. It's anyway required to move to the PhD level from the master's. The PhD is a consolidated mixture of the PhD level courses and the master's courses. And once you pass the qualifiers, master's is granted to you that sets you free from the PhD commitment. Now, I am a live example of this. My original admission to University of Rhode Island was a PhD admission in environmental and resource economics. It was right after the first 2 semesters that I found out that economics of poverty or developmental economics was a more preferred option for me. So I decided to quit the PhD and take the qualifiers. Passing the qualifiers, I obtained the master's from URI. The US education system, in my opinion, is one of the best in the world. Some countries in Europe have either more flexible systems or are more restrained. In these countries, you would typically find a language requirement that needs to be fulfilled to obtain a PhD admission. The Nordic countries are kind of flexible, and so is Germany and Switzerland. In Germany, DAAD scholarships, many of you may have heard of it, are quite popular with international students. Switzerland has its own system, and some schools happen to offer sponsorships to international students as part of their internal policies, but such systems are not standardized across all schools, and so you may have to find your way out. Before I end, I would like to refer to one of Achin sir's, comments. He said that education needs to be larger than life. I think my education has taught me more than the degrees I've earned in the United States, and I'm very thankful to the US for offering me the opportunity that the country did. So with this, I would like to hand over to Shubayu. I hope I have been able to do some justice to the topic and would like to wish all of you the very best in all of your overseas endeavors. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Over to you, Shubayu.
Thank you, Meghna. Thank you for walking us through your experiences as a student in the US. It is wonderful to hear about those nitty-gritties, those various facets of US education that you know from first-hand experience.
Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, as Achin mentioned earlier, we have a very, very experienced panel today for you. As you heard from Meghna, who herself has an experience studying in the US. And we also have a very experienced senior educator who would walk us through the various aspects of overseas education in our schools today. Before doing that, I'll just take a couple of minutes to tell you about Notebook. We at Notebook are an EdTech organization. What we do is create short videos tailored to the school curriculum. Now, what this means is right from classes 1 through to class 12, for every subject, for every topic, you would find short videos present on our app and our website. Now, these videos come in handy in two different cases. One is when you as a teacher are taking a class yourself. You would need some amount of content that you play to your students during your online classes, or maybe even during an offline class. These videos, being just 6 to 10 minutes in duration, offer the perfect visual introduction to whatever you're going to teach. Imagine teaching history to a child who's perhaps disengaged and getting this animated hand-drawn video to engage the child with the topic. The second advantage that these videos offer is that they are also available to your students from their homes. Yes, on their smartphones, on their laptops, or whatever connected device they have at home, they can access Notebook videos. These videos then offer two kinds of help. One, the student definitely gets a chance to revise the topic through the videos, but more importantly, the videos serve as a memory aid. They remind the student of what exactly you had said in class the day when you had played this video. What I'm going to do now is play you a short snippet of one of the Notebook videos so that you know how it is that our content looks like.
The Arawaks, or the Arawakian Lucaos, were tribes of a peaceful nature compared to the Caribs. They were expelled from their original homes in the Lesser Antilles by the Caribs and made their homes in the islands of the Caribbean Sea, known as the Bahamas today. The Arawaks hunted, fished, and grew vegetables and crops like sea potatoes, tubois, cassava, and corn for their livelihoods. Their well-built canoes and skills at boat riding helped them fish in the open seas. Besides, they were animists and had faith in the power of shamans who connected them with the supernatural world. Shamans were much like the tantric figures in Asiatic traditions, who acted as conduits communicating on behalf of others with the spiritual world. Both shamans and tantrics are also known to heal physical and psychological diseases. The Arawaks were skilled weavers, and the hammocks they weaved attracted the Europeans who visited the Caribbean islands. They also made and wore gold ornaments and exchanged them for glass beads brought by the Europeans. The islanders had been seen wearing gold, and they had also approached Columbus's ship Santa Maria to exchange pieces of gold. This made Columbus assume that there were extensive gold mines in the landmass of the Caribbean. Gold rushes began to the Caribbean with special focus on Cuba and Spain or Hispaniola.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you just now saw, the use of rich hand-drawn illustrations, the drawing of references from contemporary paintings of the periods being taught about, and such background research help us at Notebook develop content that is truly engaging for the young learners. I would like to invite you all to have a visit on our website, www.notebook.school, where you would find more than 10,000 such videos at your disposal. Our content has been the reason why we have been chosen by companies like BSNL and Paytm to partner with them so that their customers can benefit from our content. Not only in content, Notebook also offers a fair bit in terms of students' engagement through other activities. Currently, we are conducting the Ignite event, which is an international inter-school online innovation and entrepreneurship challenge. We are essentially asking school students, young learners, to pick up real-world problems, come up with innovative solutions, and pitch them to experts from IIM Calcutta Innovation Park, just as a startup would pitch their ideas to investors. This allows them to develop their critical thinking, their creativity, and really come up with innovative solutions. Today, just before this webinar, we had the first masterclass where experts from IIM Calcutta Innovation Park and two very seasoned entrepreneurs spoke to more than 300 students on the journey of entrepreneurship. Tomorrow, they'll be teaching them how to build business plans, and day after tomorrow, they'll be telling them what makes a good business pitch. We've already had 64 schools for this event. However, we have opened up a couple of extra slots. In case your school has not yet registered for the event, I would request you, please give your students this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of getting mentored by experts from IIM Calcutta on how to become successful problem solvers. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, we will now come back to the discussion at hand. As I said, we have a wonderful panel lined up for you. Unfortunately, I believe Mr. Arizalvi could not make it due to some unforeseen reasons. However, we are extremely privileged to have with us Dr. Meenakshi Narula. Dr. Meenakshi Narula is the principal of the Chelmsford Futuristic K-12 School in Auraya, an inspiring academic leader, MIE Master Trainer, Adobe Creative Educator Level 2, and an ardent advocate of technology integration in education and game-based learning. She is the founder and CEO, Mentoring the Mentors, MSME registered and ISO certified institute, an institute that accelerates learning curves. She conducts various community outreach programs to reach the unreachable by conducting workshops and summer programs for the government school students and teachers. She has been associated with the arena of education and igniting young minds since 2001. Dr. Narula is a multifaceted, versatile person who has the command over teaching logistics of science, the nitty-gritty of language, and the technical concepts of IT while focusing on sustainable development goals. Rashtriya Shiksha Ratan, Global Teacher Awardee, ICT Facilitator, Most Innovative and Engaging Teacher Award winner, Digital Principal and Superwoman Awardee, Excellence in Pedagogy Teaching during Pandemic, Outstanding Principal of the Year for incorporating innovative ways of learner-centered learning during pandemic, and Outstanding Leadership Award during pandemic are just some of the many awards that she has been conferred with. She is currently empowering the teachers for facilitating digital education through blended learning systems. Ma'am, thank you so much for gracing this platform. It's a privilege to have you here today. I shall start my video, stop the screen share so that we can get on a discussion. Ma'am, once again, thank you so much for being here. It's an absolute privilege to have you. Very good evening.
Thank you, sir, for inviting me on this wonderful platform. And you have already explained so many, things about me, about my achievement, about what I have been doing for the teacher empowerment and all. That is what my sole objective is of doing like that. And today's is a wonderful topic that you have taken, education overseas. And I have heard Ms. Meghna and earlier also, in the beginning too, like what all perspectives they are discussing about this overseas education.
Wonderful, ma'am. Well, I have a couple of questions for you, but given that it's just the two of us having a conversation, we'll try and keep this fluid and free flowing as much as possible. To start off with, ma'am, in a lot of things, and this is not just in education, this is clothing, cars, and a lot of things. We have seen this perceived superiority of all things foreign. Now, how much of this exists in education as well?
See, I'll tell you, certainly, rightly said, whether it's about we have to buy anything, proper clothing, brands and all, we talk about anything, right from the daily needs, right? We talk about something that is branded, maybe is made in some foreign country, abroad, whatever we think about, we think like that must be of good quality standards and all. We always compare like that. So that is in our mind. And same is there for education also. But here I would like to talk about some another perspective too. It's not about only branding. Branding is one aspect that is really very important. When we talk about quality is more important than quantity, right? So in we have also come to know about, as and when we talk about how many scientists are there in other countries, how many the persons they have been awarded with so many different Nobel prizes and other things, like, so they have been inventing because they have been learning through practicals. They have been experiencing their learning. So I mean, that is a great factor when we talk about quality education. We talk about here, that is maybe, I won't say that it's assumption or it's our notions only. Like when we talk about, like in our country, we talk, consider about mugging up of knowledge, cramming of the content. I won't say this thing because I am not doing the same practice in my school, and wherever I have worked till now, we have not been teaching in this manner. But still, I have been observing there are so many schools where this practice is being followed, and because of that, we are thinking, yes, it is like that foreign education is a brand and that gives us quality. When we talk about different curriculums and all, yes, they are involving different strategies. So I mean, we, instead of learning from them, instead of incorporating those strategies into our curriculum, we just think, okay, that is the best and we can go for that. So certainly that is an opinion in each and everybody's mind. Yes, foreign education is the best.
Right, ma'am. Do you think it has a lot to do with the way our evaluation system is, given that we put so much stress on memory?
Certainly, sir. Actually, the thing is, everything, whenever we are teaching anything in our class, how, I mean, I can be too much creative. I can have so many different strategies. When we're talking about on this online platform, we have been incorporating so many digital tools in our classes to make the classes engaging, enriching. All we talk about competency-based education, experiential learning. When we talk about Bloom's taxonomy, reaching to creation level, we are teaching through a number of wonderful strategies. We are making our lesson plans accordingly, learner-based centered education. But when it comes to evaluation, again, we give that kind of questions, right? Certainly when the children, they think about it, let me tell you here, I would like to share one example with you. Like here, when we have been teaching very, very creatively in the school, okay, and using number of strategies, we have also established research and innovation cell in our school, and we have been researching, incorporating number of strategies too. But even then, why the students, they go for different coaching classes? Why do they go? They think like in school, they keep on involving us in number of activities. They make us do this, they make us do that. After all, what will happen when the child will appear in any of the board examinations? The marks matter, right? So that's why they go to different coaching classes. They keep on mugging up the content. They go for there's help books, guides, and all. They just cram the matter, right? And then they just vomit out in the examination. So certainly, I would like to say the process of evaluation needs to be changed. Instead of summative examination, it has to be formative examination that will be facilitating the students' knowledge. Assessment for learning and assessment as learning should be considered instead of this normal summative examination that just measures students' learning.
Wonderful, ma'am. One of the things that we have seen in the last, I think, 10 or 12 years is parents who had moved abroad. For a typical profile would be, let's say somebody growing up in Hyderabad or Bangalore, moved to the US for their undergraduate studies, settled there, worked for a few years. When they have children that reached about 8 or 9 years of age, they came back to India. And more often than not, the excuse was, I want my children to study their schooling in India at least. Do you think somewhere we have scored better than, let's say, the West in terms of value-based education?
Sir, values and sanskars, they are really very important. And being a parent, you see, everybody think like my child should be obedient, should be having all the different values, courtesy. I mean, all those things we expect in our children. When we look at the children or maybe adults, I would like to say, in other countries, when we watch their lifestyle very, very closely, like then we realize, in Hindi we say dur ke dhol suhavne, like then we realize ki no, it's not like that. We do not want our children to be like that. So we that time for us, sanskars, the values, they become really very important. Then we think like that, right? And sir, another thing, then when what you are asking, like they come here to India for the schooling, but they prefer college or higher education like to be completed in other countries. Let me tell you, there is one more thing. It's really not like that they prefer like education is better, higher education is better in foreign countries. No, they have some different objective. Like base is developed in the schools only. If they prefer schools over here, the children, they can study anywhere, but their objective is something different. They want to go there for better living standards. They want to go there so that the children, they can have even part-time jobs also while studying. That is their objective. They want to settle over there for having better living standards, for better medical facilities, for even free child education. Number of other things are there that is there in their mind. I am right now sitting here in Punjab, right? Yesterday I reached it. Each and every nook and corners, you will see a board saying, come here for IELTS, complete the course, and you'll go to Canada and some different countries and all. Why? You see, here we are not able to find people in different companies for recruitment and all. Why? All the young blood, like they have been immigrated to different countries. They want to go there for better living standards. And there is one more thing, dignity of labor is there. Whatever job, whatever they are doing, like they are not thinking like that. Nobody is saying anything to them. And here we need to change our perspective, right? So that sanskars, they are very, very important, whatever your question is, but that should be lifelong, I would like to say.
Yes, I mean, to be very honest, it looks a little hypocritical at times that things were all hunky dory until your child needed to get away from the bullying, the harsh reality of perhaps American public school education. Ma'am, but you're right. This seems to almost like a mantra, right? School India, college abroad, and this is practiced so widely. In fact, I went to an engineering college in India. By the end of engineering, there were clearly two sets of students: the CAT set and the GRE set, right? And there was a very, very large set of people who decided to take the GRE exams. Why is this? I mean, Indian colleges are perhaps more difficult to get into. That could be a deterrent. But do you think it's that? Or like Meghna said, there are actual structural differences. My question also is, do you think students are aware of these differences before they get there?
Sir, are you able to hear me? Because I guess there was some
Yeah, I can hear you. Did you get my question, ma'am?
For connection error. Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, fine. So as my internet connection is actually unstable, sorry for that. So The thing is, actually, there are some structural differences that are there, but as with the advent of NEP 2020, we are going to make a lot many changes also in our structure, as you have, well, everybody is talking about it, the basic structure. Right from an early age, we are having, I mean, a lot of plans to make changes, and everybody now is all set. All the schools, even they started teacher training sessions also for that. Most of them have already started implementing various strategies, whether it is technology integration, art integration. Even nowadays, I would like to say CBSE's initiatives, AI, artificial intelligence integration in each and every subject. Can you imagine? Mathematics, sciences, social sciences, even Hindi, our mother language, which is we are teaching it through artificial intelligence. And that is a wonderful initiative by CBSE. And we at our school have started incorporating, and other schools, they have also been doing it. And I do appreciate the efforts of our education department. Like, they have been taking many wonderful steps for that. And structure, yes, certainly. And you know very well, when it's talking about higher education, earlier it was, there were number of dropouts. Talking about, we have completed 1 year of graduation, and because of some of the circumstances, we are unable to complete it, and then we have to drop out. Now, if we'll be completing 1 year, we'll be getting a certificate, then a diploma, then a degree. And certainly we are also making those structural changes that are required. Maybe it has been, I mean, the decision has been taken after many years, but finally we are here. And I am pretty sure, like, we will be having wonderful structure. And even students from different countries, they would be looking forward to education in India.
I think that's a wonderful thought, ma'am. I mean, I would love to see India become a destination for education. Just as today we are sitting here talking about overseas education, the brain drain that we see in undergraduate and graduate education, maybe in a few years' time, some American edtech company will have their own webinar where they will ask American teachers that why are our students flying to India after their O levels. Well, ma'am, thank you so much for being here. I think you answered some wonderful questions, and it was great to get your perspective on that. We can see that there are certain network issues that might be happening because your video is often getting stuck. But thank you so much for making the time. Thank you for having this chat with us. It's been an absolute privilege having you. Achin, if I may invite you now to do the vote of thanks.
Yeah, really, I think great session today. So much appreciate some good exchange of thoughts. Meghna, first of all, I sincerely thank you. I think for sharing your experience at Columbia as well as other institutions, and a lot of insights. So I'm sure there's some good takeaways, great takeaways for our esteemed educators in this forum. And also, I guess your perspective was very neutral and holistic, without being colored by any kind of bias. So I think, be it in terms of selection criteria in overseas universities, be it in terms of how you have seen US students scoping up instead of having, I'd say, a more lenient schooling, maybe in later years during their graduation, etc., how they have cooked up, etc. So I think it was quite neutral. So I think thank you for that. Of course, Meenakshi ma'am, I sincerely thank you for being a part of Together for Education webinar and for sharing your perspective. So I think some very good points you raised, ma'am, including your take on the assessment system. I guess that is very important, and also on values. So this is something that all of us would undoubtedly agree to, the importance of values and how they're like real building blocks for students, and something that really stays on with them for the rest of their life. And also the fact the students, aspire for better living standards. So undoubtedly something that, I guess one of the more main attractions, because when someone, for most students, I'll not say for all, those who aspire to study abroad, etc., of course, post completion of their studies, staying on in that particular country, finding employment, and very often better living conditions, be it in terms of health facilities, education, etc., that undoubtedly plays a very major role. So I think. And the other point you mentioned, which I found very, very interesting and insightful, is with regard to dignity of work. Undoubtedly, that's something which is important and a takeaway from today's session, which we find so often. So I think that was a great interaction, undoubtedly. And I think the other part is with NEP coming in and with so much of changes happening in our country, and with really, when I see the next generation of Indians, young Indians, who are really confident and have the winning attitude. I'm very optimistic that that day is not far when undoubtedly India will be able to position itself as a global education hub. When we'll see students from all across the world traveling to India for education. So with that note of optimism and hope, so I sign up for the evening. I thank all of you for being a part of this. Thank you and take care.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.